Hello, and thank you for joining us in Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to informal discussion of the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Kate, and I'm one of the co-hosts.
My name is Cody.
My name is Luke.
And I'm Will.
And we are back to finish our discussion of Chapter 9 that we would have started last week. The chapter was just sort of too packed full of things and ideas to fit into one episode, so we've decided to split it in half. And last episode, in case you did not listen to it for one reason or another, but are listening to this half, covers some more backstory with DL and the beginning of her relationship with Takeshi, as well as the, I'll say, interesting surroundings that Takeshi came from. But as for the second half of this chapter, Will, do you have a summary for us?
I do. So, picking up roughly where we left off. DL has just fled. Takeshi has just realized that, well, maybe something wasn't quite right about this whole rendezvous that he was placed into. But apparently, the vibrating palm requires deep familiarity with the target. So, fortunately, after DL has fled, he seems to have more time than most. Plenty of time to track her down to Kunoichi once again, where she's run to for advice. After a thorough reprimand from who but Sister Rochelle, she repledges herself to the sisterhood, just in time for Takeshi to arrive, to be got the throat clear. Be semi-posthumously revived with a by then renowned Puncutron machine. Noting a similarity between the two, unintended victim and unwanted assailant, Sister Rochelle binds them together, both karmic retribution for DL and amortized payment for the services rendered for Takeshi. DL insists on only one clause, no sex, which turns out to make up most of Takeshi's pound of flesh. Out driving soon after, they settle on lunching at a barbecue joint, where they become acquainted with the phenomenon of Thanatoia. Fumimoto, the clever businessman, notes the shared root cause of the Thanatoid way of life, karmic injustice resulting in posthumous life. A sort of inversion of Fumimoto's post-dated living, nearly all seeking eternal rest via some version of resentment. This presents an excellent opportunity for the duo to start performing adjustments, somehow hoping beyond hope to resuscitate the already gone. Soon after opening shop, they make close acquaintance with Blood and Vato of Blood and Vato Towing, as two of the only businesses willing to work for the Thanatoid populace. The mutual feeling between them seems to be one of reserved amusement. We're further introduced to Blood and Vato's less-known partner, Thanatron, who inspires an odd degree of fear and subservience in the front men, and how she's introduced to them. And as the towers circulate the coastal stretch, they develop some intuitive connection to the land, one which apparently leads to their obsession with Sasquatch. The relevant part to Prairie comes with the appearance of Weed Atman on the side of the road. Once the leader of the revolutionary sect of cinematography that Fernesi and DL had helped to build, now reduced to Thanatoia, Weed wanted his grievance with the traitor settled. It's only then that Prairie understood her mother's complicity in Brock Vaughn's machinations. To distract herself, Prairie turns to the seemingly haunted variety loaf deep in the back of the freezer. It literally glows. And as the depths of debate this inspires begin to dawn on her, she can only start to wish for a different life when DL takes her aside and says it's time to leave. And so all three of them get in the back of her coupe and ride off.
Thank you, Will. Starting as we always do with overall thoughts on the chapter, what did we think of the second half of Chapter 9?
I don't want to say it's darker because there was certainly dark elements in the first half, but I think there's more of a dark undertone that kind of seeps through the second half, especially when you get into the the sort of Vietnam allusions and all that kind of permeate especially the back half of this half of the chapter.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, there are some absolutely hilarious parts in here as well. Blood and Vato are always good for providing some comedic relief. So that's always a welcome break from everything. And there's also a lot of, I think, well, maybe not a lot of, but the sort of mysticism element that Pynchon brings into a lot of his work comes in here with the Yurok and the Woj or Wogue. I'm not sure how to pronounce that properly, but I think I said last time that I like the second half of this chapter more than the first, and I think I still stand by that. I like the chapter as a whole a lot, but I think between the two halves, I probably do enjoy the second half a little bit more. It's a little weirder, but I do like weird. So,
Luke, Will, what did you guys think?
Yeah, I like the back half of this chapter a lot. Overall, this chapter is, one of my favorites, like I said last week. Um, all the stuff with the Puncutron is pretty funny. The stuff
yeah,
about Takeshi choosing which music to listen to while he's being worked on is really funny. The description of or the kind of different CDs and stuff. I mean, some of our younger listeners might not be aware of the kind of bargain bin CD and cassette tape things that were in like dollar stores
yeah,
and at least up until the 90s. It's
real
definitely a
treasure trove.
thing. Yeah. I think I've seen them even into the 2000s and even into the 2010s. I haven't seen
Oh
them
yeah,
in a
oh yeah.
while. But yeah, that was definitely a thing. That's all pretty funny. The ending of the chapter is super cinematic. Um, it definitely kind of reminded me of different kind of war movies and stuff with them kind of moving through the compound hurriedly and Takeshi stealing the wine and them going down the freight elevator. Um, I can't think of a specific movie that it seems to be referencing, but it does seem to be pretty cinematic to me. Um, and yeah, I mean, as I said last week, Takeshi constantly taking all the drugs and everything is just pretty funny. We do get the Babies of Wackiness TV show, which does seem to be a kind of a commentary on cable television in America and how there's like an endless amount of television content being put out and an endless amount of TV channels. Which I guess goes back even to the 80s, which I wasn't necessarily aware of. Um, but yeah, this chapter is really fun. I really like this chapter.
Yeah, I really I I find this half of the chapter, as my co-hosts are well aware, baffling but enchantingly so. I think it's got some of the densest content of the entire book, if I remember correctly. And it's these really incredibly depressing ways of conceiving of collective trauma that America and the world had gone through in the previous decades. Right up next to, Takeshi just down in fistfuls of speed and barbiturates. Right next to Vato and Blood, like, slowly becoming believers in Sasquatch. There's a lot going on here, and most of it's very goofy, but when you break down the goofiness, it really is very somber to me. I like it reading through it, but it always leaves this always it leaves this kind of heavy metallic taste in my mouth.
That's a pretty good description of kind of how that portion of the chapter feels. That's for sure.
Mhm.
I also enjoy the second half of this chapter. I think I like the first half more. I really like the way that Pynchon lays out the sequence of events in the first half and how you kind of witness all of the information from DL's point of view, and then it swaps over to the Godzilla footprint scene, and then slowly you understand why he reset to there and how the two sort of are going to intertwine. I think that the structural aspects of how he lays out the first half of the chapter make me enjoy it more, but there is certainly a lot to love in the second chapter, and certainly a lot to talk about. albeit in, I would say, maybe a different way than the first half. But they're both great. They're both absolutely great. I do find it interesting that it is all one chapter, because I don't know if anyone mentioned it in last week's episode, but it does feel like there is a natural stopping point halfway through where, you know, it didn't necessarily have to continue into the same chapter. But I'm sure Pinchon had a good reason for that. I doubt that he does anything for no reason. Looking at the actual sort of procedural events of the chapter, I would say that probably the first funny moment that stands out in this section for me is Takeshi just downing pills on an airplane, to the point where the person he's been sat next to is concerned that he's going to kill himself. Not necessarily seemingly from a standpoint of, like, you know, a human level, but just like, please don't do that when I'm the one who has to sit next to you and probably talk to, like, the stewardess about it.
I have an unspoken responsibility for your safety right now.
Yeah. And eventually Takeshi lands in San Francisco and gets himself checked out. I love that whole scene where they're checking, like, his heart meridians and the holes in his suit, and trying to sort of diagnose what may have happened to him in one way or another to explain, like, what he needs to do next. I think that's such an interesting scene. Cody, you have it in here about blending fantasy into reality, which is very much a good way to describe that.
Yeah, it's something we talked about last week too. That, you know, something that would seem on paper as silly as, you know, the vibrating hand of death or the ninja death touch or whatever you want to call it. But here it's, you know, it's treated in such a way that it's presented as it is a thing. Maybe this really did happen, and it's done with such my brain today. It's done in such a way that it doesn't come off as being over the top necessarily. It's done with just the right amount of realism to where it works. You know, we all know as a reader that obviously it's not a thing, but it plays into the story in such a way that it's very believable, and it serves the story, and it doesn't feel ham-fisted, it doesn't feel forced in. It just feels like, yeah, she really did that to him, and here's the impact of it. And now he's, you know, we're seeing the physicality of what was done.
It's kind of like the reverse of The Exorcist, where so much of that movie starts with a bunch of doctors not knowing what's wrong with Reagan, whereas he's able to go to a doctor and, like, oh yeah, you just got attacked by the vibrating palm.
Yeah, we've got a calculator for that. You're
good. What was the Gravity's Rainbow connection that you had potentially seen with his character?
Oh, that was what we talked about a while back with him being the kamikaze pilot in Gravity's Rainbow having the same name.
Oh, right.
I don't know if I'm not trying to say that's the same person. I don't know if the timelines would add up, because I don't know. Are we told how old Takeshi is at this point?
I don't think so.
No, but it is said that he was a kamikaze, or at least he claims to have been.
It's in there, but it's not a direct enough connection for me to say, like, oh yeah, that's, you know, definitely the same character. It wouldn't surprise me, knowing Pinchon's you know, put other characters into other books at certain times. So it's one of those implied things, but I don't think there's a strong enough case to be made either way necessarily.
Yeah, I think kamikaze pilots were typically pretty young.
Yeah, I think so.
Which you would think logically, at least, you know, in the West, that they would be older, just because, you know, they would maybe be, you know, like, I mean, really old or something. But I think because they had less family attachments and stuff, that they were typically pretty young. I want to say I remember that from studying World War II in college.
It was also considered just to be like a thing of very high honor to do. Like, parents would bring their kids down to sign up for that, like, specific division of the Imperial Air Force, which is, yeah, to Western mindset is pretty crazy to think about. But they believed they were embodying the same winds that had protected the Japanese islands from, you know, the Mongols and so many other people prior to then.
So, and just for reference for anyone listening who didn't catch it, maybe the paragraph is on page 175. It says she was referring to what he had a way of calling his quote interesting work with airplanes during World War II. Though to be frank, she also continued, I can't imagine you in anybody's Air Force, let alone the kamikaze, who I understand from the history books were fairly picky about who flew for them. So it's one of those things I think is probably done that way just to play with the reader a little bit, just have us wondering.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, jumping to the Gravity's Rainbow connection, I think it's hard to say whether Takeshi is a character or if he's a character in the world of the book, right?
Yeah.
It's very hard to tell just reading the novel, and so it's tempting to let this representation of the same broad strokes character, same name, same rough history, it's tempting to say that that's an indication one way or the other, but honestly I find it more obfuscating than anything else. it really makes me want to like think more about, okay, what is breaking down in that section of that book, and then what is being built on in this section of this book, because either way it seems like they cannot both hold like a realist value within the stories.
Well, if anything else, too, I mean, it seems that potentially Pinchon started from a perspective of, okay, I have this character who, even though this woman basically killed him, he's still very attracted to, and is sort of like chasing around and constantly wanting to sleep with her again. Maybe he just is very fixated on his own death. Oh, maybe he used to be a kamikaze pilot for the same reason. And then maybe that was how he worked backwards. Because I find that's very interesting, is that he was a kamikaze pilot, obviously not a very good one, given that he is still alive in 1984. But there is several mentions of him continuing, especially after he finally reaches, the Ninjet retreat and is reunited with DL. There's several mentions of the fact that he is just inexorably still attracted to her. And it always mentions in those sentences the fact that he shouldn't be because she's killed him, or he shouldn't be because he doesn't understand why he would be. So there seems to be something there about Takeshi flirting with his own death, or interested in his own death, in a very unique way, which obviously wraps around with their conversation with the Thanatoid at the barbecue restaurant, which we'll eventually get to. But for now, what about the scene where he shows back up at the retreat, and the song that he sings, and the Puncutron? What did we think of this chunk?
I think it's notable that the Thanatoids are defined by their not inherently defined by this, but the major characteristic of them is their obsession with television.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the inverted Thanatoid in the form of Takeshi just singing this song that is entirely about like living one's life as though it were an excerpt from a film.
Yeah.
While also doing what appears to be like a chorus line kick towards this woman that he's become obsessed with.
There's some real showmanship that's getting put on here.
Yeah. To the point of confusing all of the other members of this commune.
Yeah. As far as the Puncutron, I just the idea of it alone, like if you just really can kind of conceptualize what this is, it's absolutely hilarious. And I love the little throwaway line about the detractors included the ever vigilant FDA, one step ahead of whom the Puncutron's producers had so far just managed to keep. Like with all there, every time there's some shady like medicine, quote unquote medicine, or therapy or something like that really pushes the limitations of or the definitions of the word therapy or treatment or whatever. It always seems like their secondary goal is making sure they can skirt around whatever FDA regulations would hamper them from doing what they're doing. So I love that that's in here, but I think my favorite thing is the as Luke mentioned earlier, the musical selections that are available for accompaniment while the Puncutron is working, which includes the all regimental bagpipes play primetime favorites or Taiwanese healthy brain aerobics. Or my favorite is the Chipmunks sing Marvin Hamlish. That one I had to
Yeah,
stop reading for a second. I was laughing so hard.
the Chipmunks one really got me too.
It is the one that is the obvious choice if you're going to be put into this position. Either that or the regimented bagpipes, obviously.
Yeah, well, you'd think that, like, if this Puncutron involves like your chi flow and all this different stuff, that you'd want like something a little bit more. I don't that the music you'd be listening to would be a little bit more important, and then it'd be more like new agey or something. I don't know.
Mhm.
I do find it really funny. It just doesn't really seem to. And I also really like that it seems to be implied that all the CDs and tapes were like shoplifted.
Yeah.
Um, but you think that like what music you're listening to would be a little bit more important in terms of like centering yourself and different stuff. But yeah,
So we have to kind of assume regarding the healthy brain aerobics from Taiwan, but the all regimental bagpipes and the chipmunks sing Marvin Hamlish it's all like these choral, very high pitched, reedy noises.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe there is something to it.
Maybe they have to balance it. It's some kind of a balancing with brainwave activity or something. When you when you listen to something like that, you have to. I don't know.
You need a
I
headache.
also love that it's like a 10-page list of this kind of stuff, which I kind of wish we had more of. But
Yeah, Pinchon, just give us all 10 pages of these.
yeah, man.
Of these tracks.
I know he wrote it. I know he wrote 10 pages of this kind of stuff.
Oh yeah, definitely. Just like he had all those extra limericks lying around that
Yeah.
he never gave us.
These are the deep cuts we need.
Yeah, that's the kind of stuff that's going to be in his archive. There is a lot of funny stuff with music in this latter half of the chapter too, because when DL explains to him the punishments or the penance that she will have to do if she breaks the year-long protectorate clause, that stuff had me just dying with laughter. Just the
ordeal of the 1,000 Broadway show tunes.
Yeah.
The Andrew Lloyd Webber Chamber of We Never Find Out.
We never find out because Takeshi stops her. But Lord Almighty, could the chamber of Andrew Lloyd Webber not be anything good?
Yeah,
that's for sure. Yeah, I don't think that I could endure 1,000 show tunes played back to back. I definitely think that would drive me insane.
That would be my unraveling for sure.
I was definitely thinking they were layered on top of each other.
Oh, that's almost worse.
I feel like that would be worse if you just had to
be pink noise.
I mean, at a certain point, yeah, you lose any kind of structure or coherence to what's being played at you for sure. And that number's got to be far less than 1,000, I'd imagine. So yeah, we figure out that the two of them are going to have to go through the world together for a year and a day, in hopes that makes up for the I don't even know, ill-fated tete-a-tete from the earlier half of this chapter, I guess is maybe how I describe it. And there's this interesting scene, sort of the night before they leave the Ninja commune, where one of the other members sneaks into Takeshi's room and has sort of this heart-to-heart conversation about DL and sort of where she's at in life at that point. Does anyone have any thoughts that they wanted to add to that, about that conversation?
So I would like to say that I find it kind of, I think that yes, obviously it's about DL, but I think that this is, on some level, Finchen kind of trying to summarize a very popular strain of thought in feminism in the 80s. This kind of reworking of original sin to feature on, I guess one way to put it is the Y chromosome.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, I also think that it's way too it fits way too well with the actual like world that this book is working in for me to think that it's some kind of ironic statement of it. It does seem in line with my very nearly totally ironic reading of Gravity's Rainbow, which I'm not going to get into. But I think
No?
no, not right now. No, it's it's a whole other book, Kate. We can't do that.
Podcast within a podcast.
Just to say that I think that there's a lot of there's this the sheer quantity of masculinity in that book is ridiculous, and I think by intention. And I think that that kind of summary of history is probably somewhat closer to Pynchon's worldview than the traditionally assumed one.
That's a fair point. I could definitely see where you're coming from with that.
Mhm.
I think the dropping of Lilith and Eve and Adam is interesting to me for a couple of reasons. I mean, A, obviously for all the reasons Will just said, but also B, he does change the Lilith story from what is out in like the real world, which I find interesting. I don't know how like widely known some of this stuff is, but there are a lot of different like interpretations of Lilith. There are a lot of different allusions to a Lilith like figure from different cultural histories. It isn't just something that exists within like the Hebrew Bible. There's things that are from the Akkadian language. There are things from Mesopotamian mythology, from the Gilgamesh cycle, and from different sort of archaeological finds that kind of point towards a similar figure. But like for those of our listeners who don't know much about this story, it's this idea in Jewish folklore, primarily within the Babylonian Talmud, that basically says that Lilith was Adam's first wife and was formed out of the same clay that Adam himself was. So obviously that's very different from the actual reading that most people are going to have from reading Genesis, where Adam's wife is Eve and is formed out of a rib of Adam. And from there, it is said that sort of Lilith is almost like a demon and is the mother of Adam's demonic children. She essentially is banished from the Garden of Eden for not complying with or actually following the sort of dictates of the Hebrew God as it relates to women obeying men and sort of the familial structure. There's some belief that she may have been mentioned in the book of Isaiah, but after those particular translations have kind of not fully borne out, she's mostly just referenced in secondary literature like the Talmud. She's mentioned in Eruvin 100b, Niddah 24b, Shabbat 151b, and Bava Batra 73a. And she's also like a figure in Jewish like mysticism. The Zohar is the big book for that, and we've talked about that in relation to Kabbalah before. But I think it's interesting that it's changed a little bit from what the storyline within those texts is to what it is here in the actual book. And I think that Will kind of is explaining probably why Pynchon makes that change. But just for the edification of the listeners, she is essentially Adam's first wife within Jewish folklore, and that she's banished from the garden for giving birth to A, demonic children, and also B, not obeying Adam. And she believed in particular that she was on like the same level as Adam. She believed that she should be treated the same way as man should. So Lilith also does have this feminist connection because she was inherently looking for equality, which within the Hebrew framework is not something that women should be looking for, especially not during that period.
David Cowart in his book The Dark Passages of History does get into he names DL as Lilith, Fernesi as Eve, I think Weed as Adam, and Brock as the serpent in that book, in his chapter on Vineland, which is a chapter on the 3 California novels. I remember whenever I was reading it, it occurred to me that he doesn't really necessarily explain the significance of that or why he thinks that, but it is something that that's an aspect of the story that he explores in that book. If anyone's interested in reading more.
Well, I guess we should maybe just go through the actual quote here. There's probably some positivity to be brought of that. Cody, do you have that handy, or does anyone have that quote handy?
I have it handy, yeah. One night, as he was laying in bed watching a Bionic Woman episode, the head ninjet came in to turn down the volume and to tell Takeshi another kind of bedtime story. Hey, she was just about to... Jamie Summers will understand. This is important, so listen up. It takes place in the Garden of Eden. Back then, long ago, there were no men at all. Paradise was female. Even her sister, Lilith, were alone in the garden. A character named Adam was put into the story later, to help make men look more legitimate. But in fact, the first man was not Adam, it was the serpent. I like this story, said Takeshi, snuggling into his pillow. It was sleazy, slippery man, Rochelle continued, who invented good and evil, where before women had been content to just be. In among the other confidence games they were running on women at the time, men also convinced us that we were the natural administrators. Men also convinced us. Men also convinced us that we were the natural administrators of this thing, morality they'd just invented. They dragged us all down into this wreck they'd made of the creation, all subdivided and labeled, handed us the keys to the church, and headed off toward the dance halls and the honky-tonk saloons. Now, behind those jive Oscar Goldman shades, you look bright enough to understand that I'm talking about Dara Louise. For all her personal distance with people, she won't have an easy time out there with you, because she never does, and it might not be out of line if now and then you'd entertain a few kind moments of thought on her behalf. Takeshi raised his shades and gave her the eye-to-eye, intrigued by the expression on her face. She could almost have been asking for a favor. My pleasure, but there was more? The head ninjet, using only her eyebrows, shrugged. Don't commit original sin. Try and let her just be.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of different ways that you can interpret that out as it relates to Vineland or Pynchon's, view of history or men and women. I think that it offers a lot to consider. I find it surprising that David Cowart wouldn't expound upon that in his book. Did he say basically anything at all, or just he drew the lines between the characters and the mythological characters?
I think he was talking about those four characters as like those characters from the Bible and Jewish mythology in the context of like Brock tempting Frenesi to the dark side, basically to the Federales side, to the federal side, and Weed kind of being caught in the crossfire. And I don't remember anything about DL and Lilith, and then like yeah, so Weed being caught in the crossfire, and then Frenesi kind of tempting him also over to the dark side, to the federal side, which is a bit of a spoiler at this point, I guess. But yeah, I mean, he does kind of talk about that a little bit, just in the context, like I said, of Brock being like the one who tempts Frenesi. But he doesn't. I wasn't super pleased with his interpretation, just because, yeah, like I said, he doesn't get into like the nitty gritty of exactly what he means and exactly what that would mean for the book as a whole.
Gotcha. Does anyone else have anything they wanted to add to this particular sort of quote or section of the book? I don't want it to just turn into me talking at length.
No, I actually didn't know much about the whole Lilith mythology, so I was curious to hear about that as well. And yeah, I mean, based on what Luke mentioned that David Cowart said in his book, like I'm going to have to sit and think on that for a while, because I think it's an interesting through line. I just the fact that it's not really extrapolated kind of makes me wish that it was. But I think there might be something there. I just have to really give it some time to think on.
The
Yeah,
quote that Will read out, it does remind me of Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil.
Hmm.
And I do think that that's probably where Pynchon um, got this idea for good and evil being kind of artificial constructs, or in Vineland it's stated that man kind of came up with the difference between good and evil. I don't remember if Nietzsche was not the most enlightened thinker in terms of his views on women. Um, so I kind of doubt that that was taken from Nietzsche. I have read book Beyond Good and Evil, but it's been about 10 years, 9 or 10 years since I've read it. So I'm not super familiar with it anymore. But that book does get into different stuff about Judaism and stuff in a more positive light. It does portray Judaism pretty positively. But I don't remember him getting into the creation myth or anything in that book. That being said, I do think that that's could be where Pynchon got this idea of good and evil being not really actually existing in the natural world and stuff.
yeah, that wouldn't surprise me at all. Um, I think that this whole little section, the idea of casting these characters, Frenzy and DL as Eve and Lilith, I think that's one of those things that, while I'm not saying nobody should think on it, because again, these books are full of like 1,000 different equally valid interpretations. One of those facets of Pynchon's writing is his insistence on writing these analogies that break down once you realize them, and that seems like it might be one, because it's very obvious. I think it's if you're going to sit there and look at this little tiny fable in the middle of the book and say, how does this have to do with the book? You can't ignore the fact that it's a story about betrayal and a lesbian romance that is disrupted by outside corruption.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. It's all very clear, and it's so clear that it seems like one of those things that's almost a trap for the reader.
I'm glad I have you to spell that out, Will, so that I don't have to.
I'm always happy to talk in circles.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think that the surface level interpretation there is very easy to access from a standpoint of some of the stuff that we were talking about as far as the difference in how DL views Frenessy versus how Frenessy views her, and the eventual end of the relationship and the very baffling circumstances of that. And I think it's interesting that there is certainly additional room to interpret there, because what is the Mother Superior character really mean by original sin? Does she mean the issue of trying to put yourself on the same position as God? Does she mean putting yourself in a position where you're claiming the to know right from wrong? There's a lot of room to dig into that, and I think that we can kind of get bogged down in that if we keep going through it for too much longer. So this is another case where if you're a reader who is listening along with us and you have your own thoughts on this inclusion, you have your own interpretations, please let us know what those are. Because Lord knows I could talk for the next 45 minutes in circles about it and how it especially relates to probably Pynchon's wider canon. But yeah, I think that would probably just do nothing but exhaust our listeners. So if there's nothing that anyone else wanted to add in there, we can move to probably Pynchon's most engaging restaurant that he's ever written into a book, as far as it not being gross and actually seeming to be
the fact that it's normal food.
Yeah, normal food that seems pretty good. This makes me think that Pynchon probably likes barbecue and can't find it within himself to denigrate that particular culinary invention.
I think it's hard for, the way that he criticizes food in the rest of this book is all about the artificiality. It's really hard to denigrate putting some big old hunks of meat over an open fire.
Yeah, it's a pretty primal form of cooking.
In the middle of the restaurant, though, which I find hilarious, because that restaurant between the like open pit fire the people smoking cigarettes and then the people smoking joints. It must be like a Mason and Dixon coffee house as far
I was gonna
as
say, yeah, it's a
whether
real,
or not
Mhm.
people can see across the room.
real hazy atmosphere there.
Absolutely.
I do also love that the restaurant is called Your Momma Eats,
Yeah.
which is I don't. He's definitely got a penchant for Yo Mama jokes.
Mhm.
Maybe my favorite example of that comes in Against the Day. I will save that because Kate hasn't read it, so I don't want to spoil that. But there's some pretty good ones in there from a character that you wouldn't expect them to come from.
Okay.
So
Interesting.
I want some barbecue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
This is
did
the first
too
time-
after.
Reading a penchant book that I want food.
Right. It's no, who can really hate on barbecue? Like,
I know it really is.
Well, probably most vegans.
Yeah, I was about to say vegetarians, but yeah.
Well-
You can barbecue veggies too, though.
That's I
Yeah,
was gonna say my
that's
wife's a
true, that's
vegetarian and she likes a good barbecue. So
some halloumi cheese barbecued.
I mean, you grill some bell peppers.
Oh yeah.
I'm in.
Yeah, you can't go wrong. Nobody hates barbecue. Unless you're allergic to brown sugar, maybe. There's a lot of brown sugar in
Well,
barbecue.
For people.
Now we're getting into regional barbecues, and that's a dangerous territory to be diving into.
Yeah. I don't know if we want to get into that.
Yeah. And this almost seems more South Carolina with the mustard and hot peppers than
The
Texas.
drier.
Mhm. So speaking of South Carolina barbecue, most of the food that is ordered by Takeshi is eaten by a Thanatoid, which we'll get to. But we briefly have a follow up with his boss at Wawazume Life and Non-Life, who sort of more or less says to him that they're cleaning house as it relates to this whole Godzilla stomp. Do we have any follow-up thoughts on the Godzilla portion from the previous chapter with this new information? Anything about, the ideas that we talked about last week in relation to that with some more time to think on it?
I don't know if it's this section, but I do think, the part where they talk about the Godzilla having like some type of traceable like energy being left behind. I did find that really interesting. I'm not I don't know all this stuff about like different areas of the body and as it relates to like chakras and stuff. But I did find that really interesting that Godzilla would have left behind some type of like traceable life energy. I just found it interesting to think about.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. Is that I love that paragraph where they're talking about the standardized reflexology analysis, where they mapped the foot based on the imprint that it left and found all the electromagnetic signatures and stuff. That's one of those things like reflexology and all of that is a. I think maybe this is part of what has like really always drawn me to Pynchon's work since I've started reading it is the not necessarily saying that it's a valid science or anything like that, but at least giving it a sort of mysticism or air of realism that kind of if you don't believe that it is a valid thing, which I don't really buy into the whole chakras and reflexology and all that, but it's one of those things that's it's a really cool idea, and I think that's what is kind of presented here and in a lot of his other stuff is that it's that kind of mysticism is not something that we really have anymore. There are always kind of relics of these older, be it religious beliefs or just a lack of understanding of how the human body worked at the time. But it's just a really interesting concept that I just kind of wish was true.
Yeah, it might not be a way of knowing the truth in some capital T sense, but Finch's not a fan of capital T's.
Yep.
And secondarily, it's it's a way of knowing. It might be knowing essentially just like internal physiological noise, but there's something it's measuring, right?
Yeah.
I kind of take it as a kind of a confirmation of the suspicion that it wasn't actually Godzilla, because it is like reflexology.
Mm-hmm.
Say what you will about the quasi-medical purposes of reflexology, but I'm pretty sure that you can't look at a footprint and then using those practices model the being that made the footprint. That doesn't seem like a
It
proper
is-
use of
It
that.
is in tying with some of the themes of the book, though. It is a very kind of TV way of going about that. You know, in a
Absolutely.
Sure.
police procedural kind of way of, you know, like MacGyvering your way from one thing to another. Like, you know, oh, we found this fiber on the ground, and then extrapolating from that it was, you know, whatever the case may be. That's, you know, it is definitely that. It's very TV-ish.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting the level of I'll say, I guess, referential nature that this book has towards television in that respect, Cody, because that was what I thought about too. The idea that, you know, oh, we traced this footprint, and there was a portion in each part of the footprint that led us to every vital organ that could tell us
Yeah.
exactly what it had eaten, exactly what its like cholesterol was,
Yep.
and also has told us that it is a 10,000 foot tall saurian creature.
Yeah.
Yeah, very, very NCIS
It's
of
yeah. I
them.
was gonna say very CSI.
Yeah, that's for sure.
NCIS. Yeah.
So that if there's nothing else, that does bring us to the Thanatoids. What did we think about the Thanatoids and their propensity to push themselves towards some form of death involving television?
I think there's a lot. So I'll back up and say that I have seen some people online talk about how the whole Thanatoid concept slowed everything down too much for them, and they didn't like it. Which I would disagree with. I think that the Thanatoids are arguably one of the most interesting parts of the story.
Mm-hmm.
I do love the fact that that we're introduced to someone just like, you know, the idea of leaving and coming back to someone else eating my food is such a haunting thought for me. Like,
It's
just
a stranger. It's just someone random.
yeah. My social anxiety is bad enough as it is. If someone was just eating my food, I would just leave. Like, that's the end of it. That's the end of my day. I'm going home, and I'm just gonna shut down for the rest of the day. But it leads, you know, obviously leads into this whole conversation with the Thanatoids and understanding what the Thanatoids are. I did read on the Penchon wiki that you could view them as sort of an allegory or an allusion to like Vietnam vets, which is an interesting way to look at it, I think, especially when you consider that a lot of what this book is talking about is and not just this book, but this chapter, this back half of the chapter about what America has done to its people at different times, specifically with Vietnam, and the reality of them coming back and the way that they were treated upon coming back. And so I think it's interesting to look at them through that lens, and especially with their obsession with TV, which is, you know, really can be a great means of dealing with a lot of the trauma that they would have experienced. It's at the same time, though, it can also probably trigger a lot of that trauma as well. So it's a really interesting kind of force that they're really fixating on. But the fact that they're referred to as ghosts and victims, and there's mentions of what was done to them, all kind of, you know, when I read it through thinking about them as being Vietnam vets, and it kind of made a more interesting way of looking at them that I hadn't really in the past.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting to think of Thanatoids as Vietnam vets. You know, Cody mentions in the notes for the show that they're referred to as ghosts and victims, and there's mentions of what was done to them. Um, I personally link Thanatoids more towards like people who were like hippies in the 60s and early 70s who then kind of fried their brains or something. Whenever I first read this book, I didn't necessarily pick up on the ghostly aspect of the Thanatoids. I thought that they were just kind of dropouts who sat around watching TV.
Mhm.
Um, but for me, it kind of reminds me more of like stuff like Philip K. Dick's A Scanner Darkly, with people that were kind of victims of the drug culture in the 60s and 70s, who kind of fried their brains and now are just kind of like the walking wounded, or are just kind of their lives are pretty much over just because of how much they've abused drugs or something. It also kind of reminded me of that kind of the hippies, because it does seem like they're Thanatoids, like the best part of, like Thanatoids don't really live their lives anymore, like, and it does seem to be like they used to be people, regular people, and then now that they've kind of dropped out of society completely. Which also kind of reminds me of the hippie movement, and how I think we've talked about how a lot of them kind of went straight and turned into conservative wasps.
Mm-hmm.
But it just reminded me of all of that, yeah.
So my interpretation is one that I'm reluctant to go too deeply into, because I think it's a difficult one to actually like discuss with the other more relevant themes to this book. But I view them as an extension of, like, the ultimate extension of the experience that Oedipa was going through in Lot 49, and the ultimate extension of the preterites as a concept that Pynchon returns to quite a bit, or the human yo-yo, people who are fundamentally constrained and cannot themselves see those constraints that are put on them by society and or by individuals around them. And the Thanatoids are people who, yes, they've been damaged, but the karma may or may not be like a metaphysical reality for these people. It might not be that they are harmed and therefore they are like metaphysically dead. But closer to your kind of initial thoughts, Luke, with them being dropouts, but almost the opposite. They're kind of the proto, what we would now kind of lump into the incel thing these days, where they seem to be people who have decided that there is no purpose to life, and yet they still are here living, and the only way that they can survive with that is by manufacturing, the stuff, or well, consuming the manufactured stuff, which substitutes for daily life via television, and at the same time justifying their discontent with this resentment that they're manufacturing, because they don't want to be alive. They would like to be dead in some way, shape, or form, but they are not willing or able to either go through the act of suicide, or through they have just decided that that's not an option for themselves in some way, whether it's because of a conscious refusal or a subconscious dismissal. And so they are stuck in a limbo of sorts, in a more literal, realistic sense. And so if you're going to try and make sense of it all, the only way you can do so is by framing them as these metaphysically dead people who are so harmed by the world around them. Because the alternative is to essentially look at each and every one of these very many people who are clearly the victims of many wrongs, and to say, well, you are all choosing to not live lives. You are all choosing to be dead, which is a kind of an almost infinitely disgusting thing to say.
Well, and this is where I'm reminded of the article that Pynchon wrote on sloth, where there's a paragraph in there where, just towards the end, like literally the second to last paragraph, where Pynchon writes, "Unless the state of our souls becomes once more a subject of serious concern, there is little question that sloth will continue to evolve away from its origins in the long ago age of faith and miracle, when daily life really was the Holy Ghost visibly at work, and time was a story with a beginning, middle, and end. Belief was intense, engagement deep, and was fatal. The Christian God was near. Felt, sloth, defiant sorrow in the face of God's good intentions, was a deadly sin." I think that there's a real connection between what Pynchon is trying to articulate in that article and what is going on with these characters, because I don't think Pinchon is trying by any means to say that we are still living in an age where the Christian God was near, and that the Holy Ghost was visibly at work or in the world around them. I think that we've mentioned in several episodes across multiple books why that's not what Pinchon is writing about. So it's a world where sloth doesn't actually sort of get you any closer to death, because it's no longer a deadly sin. It's no longer a fatal thing to deny the world around you. But that's exactly what the Thanatoids are trying to do. They're trying to advance themselves closer to the cause of death, as it kind of says in this section where the character is introduced. But the way they're going about it is never going to get them there, because it's just a case where they can just keep watching stories over and over and over again on television forever, and there is no actual spiritual death that comes about from that in the way that it would have. Like, the world has fundamentally shifted. And then from there, you can obviously build out this idea that the world has fundamentally shifted because of things like Vietnam. And the associations between Vietnam and television are very historically clear. I wouldn't be surprised if there was some of that going on in Pinchon's head. But you could say, you know, the war on drugs, Vietnam, you know, there's so many different things that you could add into that idea of why the world has inexorably changed to become worse, and a place where, you know, so to speak, the Holy Spirit or whatever spiritual force is no longer alive. And so what they're doing renders them in this sort of weird state of karmic imbalance, because what they're attempting to do has no end. The end result they're striving for will never come, but there is also somewhat of a little death, so to speak, in not really eating food, not really leaving your house, not really doing anything other than watching TV. And I think that's why they're kind of represented in a ghostly fashion, whereas these people who are out of karmic balance, because their end goal is not available to them anymore, but they're trying anyway, and they're doing enough damage that they're kind of fading out of reality or existence, so to speak, but never fully completing that cycle, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then that kind of links together with going back to the wise words that Sister Rochelle had for Takeshi.
Mm-hmm.
When DL sees these Thanatoids, she has a conversation with them. She's not like treating them like trash, but she is clearly disturbed. She is clearly, maybe not disturbed, but she doesn't view them as right in a fundamental sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's, you know, Takeshi by basically saying, well, these are people who have been wronged. That's morality. He's committing original sin there.
Yep.
Original sin isn't necessarily saying these people are wrong. You are a bad person for doing this. In this framing, original sin is the establishment of, hey, now you need to recognize these people for people. They don't deserve what you're laying on them. They're not dead. Mm-hmm. They're just wronged. And I don't know what to make of that connection, but it's right there.
Yeah, that's a lot of food for thought for both us and the listeners, I think.
Yeah.
So from there, sort of the two of them are brought back to this, you know, space where there's a lot of Thanatoids, a lot of people needing this karmic adjustment, and that's how the business starts. That's the precursor to Takeshi's excellent business card that we get a glimpse at earlier in the books. We're building some more of that backstory as the book is continuing on, and they start doing this as a business together. This is how they're going to spend the year that they have to spend together,
and a day.
And a day, yes, absolutely, to avoid the horrors of Andrew Lloyd Webber. So does someone want to, because this, I think all of us are kind of in agreement that the Blood and Vato section is like the heaviest section emotionally, probably the most obfuscated, I guess I'll say, as far as, you know, what is going on or what Pinchon is getting at. Does someone want to try and kind of give a bit of a summary or an explanation beyond the work that Will did at the beginning of the episode for this piece of the chapter? Or perhaps we can each give our understandings of what's going on.
I think it might be best to just kind of talk our way through it and see if we can maybe kind of cut our way through the dense forest that this kind of thing is. Because we were talking before we started recording about this this part of the chapter and the kind of inherent haziness that there is here as far as what's going on and who, you know, like certain people's role or capacity within it is. It's an interesting section. I don't really know where to even start with it, though, is the thing.
Well, I guess we could start with the idea that these two businesses seem to be the only ones that aren't just like giant mega corporations that want to interface with the Thanatoids.
Yeah, that's okay.
And that's how they meet, is they just happen to be the only two businesses in this basically town of,
and
what is
they
it,
share a
Springs?
building too, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I can start by just reading kind of the introduction that we get of the two of them. Waiting for them this morning were towaway teammates Vato and Blood, whom they'd met in the parking lot of the Woodbine Motel late at night, thundering along in a custom deluxe named Mi Vida Loca, searching for likely units. The boys, when Takeshi and DL had appeared in their headlights, had been scaling the cars in this lot, as timber scalers would go through a piece of forest to estimate how many board feet of lumber it contains. Their task seemed to have been straightforward. Simply choose, for towing away, the highest priced rides first. But it depended, as either partner would have been quick to explain, on the make of a high-priced ride. A Rolls-Royce owner, for instance, would know how to turn the bothersome chore of redeeming his automobile into a lighthearted adventure, cheerfully paying all the exorbitant fees, some invented on the spot, and throwing in a big tip besides. On the other hand, towing away any Mercedes, even in the short run, was a losing proposition. No Mercedes driver would ever show up at V&B Tow at 3 a.m. in any mood for fun. Vato and Blood had recently been to a workshop down at a spa in Marin on this very subject. Interpersonal Programming and the Problem Towee, in which the point had been made more than once that a Mercedes driver, in redeeming his impounded ride, shows no better manners than when he drives, trying first thing in the Marquis tradition of never signaling, an unannounced kick in the balls. So they're essentially just these kind of sleazy tow truck drivers who go around sort of ripping off people's cars that they can impound and get the most money off of, is really what they're kind of doing. And they seem to target the, I guess I'll say, exact opposite of the Thanatoids, the wealthy people that may or may not surround this area. And I guess from there, it really moves into more of a conversation about how the two of them met the third partner of their business, the woman who does all their bookkeeping. I guess is really where it kind of evolves from there, if everyone would agree with that. And they met that bookkeeper through the Vietnam War. If someone wants to pick up from there, and that whole connection between them and the previous guardian of their bookkeeper.
The show has not ended. We are all just frantically searching through this remarkably dense section of the chapter to find exactly what we all read just like an hour ago.
Yeah.
For the listener's sake, we know where this is. We just can't find it because it's so dense.
I can go back and like find the same quotes that I was reading for Will earlier, but I don't want it to just be me talking.
Okay, found it. Hey, maybe you can eat that shit. The task seemed impossible. Every eatery choice carried some risk of offense, and neither wished to call down any dragon lady type of curses from the woman who these days held in her exquisite hands every last detail of V&B's finances, including many of interest not only to the IRS, but also to organizations that were much less coy about theft. Though they went to elaborate lengths to deny it, Vato and Blood were both afraid of her. In May of 75, they'd found her languishing in Pendleton, along with thousands of others who'd flooded in after the fall of Saigon. But their history went back further, to their wartime association with Gorman the Spectre Flaff's legendary operations in money orders and piasters, into which they had bought at exactly the right moment in the Spectre's tangled financial saga to furnish them with the metaphysical edge of seeming to have performed an angelic intervention. In return, they gained the superstitious Flaff's confidence, which turned out to include naming them in his will to take over his obligations to Tyon Tran. So in some way, they've been grandfathered into some strangely almost abusive bookkeeping operation from some previous helpful man who seems to I don't get this. I truly don't understand.
No, and
this.
I know, and yeah, you literally just read it. And I'm still on this paragraph, just trying to parse out all of it. I don't. This is probably the toughest part of this chapter for me. And I know Will said the same thing as well. Like, I think that probably is the case for everybody, because even on the like on the Reddit read through that they did a couple years back, like there's almost no mention of it at all, aside from like a brief paragraph that kind of talk about how Vato and Blood are just kind of the odd couple stereotype characters. I mean, yeah, I could read this 3 or 4 times probably and still not come away with enough to make a valid argument about anything.
Yeah, and then the following paragraph, it's skipping a few lines of dialogue, essentially goes into how this Spectre Flaff fella had been paying for her education at some point in time. And I guess she just got enough dirt on him that, she was done working for him, or at least she knew that he was dead soon, and wanted another position, I guess. Or maybe she's just being pushed around. It's interesting because we don't actually get any direct descriptions of her that are not mediated by Blood and Vato.
Mm-hmm. But
Right.
it also it's implied that she's really good at her job too. So like she clearly picked up something from the classes that she did. And I'm curious about Blood and Vato's I don't want to say sense of obligation to her, but they definitely are deferential to her, whether it's because they understand that she knows more than they do, or because of her past, and they're trying to have a level of respect and make sure that she's that she knows that her work is valid and that they appreciate it. I don't know. I can't, like, there's so much, but there's so little at the same time.
I really came away from it like after, because I think like most people, reading through this section, at least before the Bigfoot stuff, which we'll obviously get to, where that's a bit, it's still, I guess, complicated, but not nearly to the same degree. I get a sense that Pynchon is trying to say something about the Vietnam War in particular. The fact that this is a woman who was kind of passed around out of that displacement from the Vietnam War and has kind of ended up in a position where she's been, willingly becoming an accountant, so to speak, but kind of unwillingly, or at least without her own input, being willed around to different people to be, at first a servant to a different group of people, and then eventually kind of the head honcho, so to speak, simply because Blood and Vato don't have any kind of competency in what she does. Like, I just get the sense that there's something Pynchon is reaching there for about America's entrance into Vietnam and the way that it displaced the Vietnamese people in a way that is very difficult to pin down, because obviously this particular character is a Vietnamese woman who has essentially lost any kind of sense of agency and has been torn away from where it is that she lived. Her family lives, I would assume, into a completely different world, and is just, again, being passed from person to person, even though one would assume that she is an adult. There's something there, I feel like, that Pynchon is reaching towards about the Vietnam War, about imperialism, or the way that it affects the people in the countries where those conflicts take place. But what specifically it is, I'm having a hard time synthesizing.
I'm wondering if if you could tie it back into the karmic adjustment, and Vato and Blood are trying to balance the negative that she's gone through with the positive of the way they treat her and their deference towards her. I don't know. Like, it's not. I can't expect for anything Pynchon does to be explicit in its meaning, but it's this is definitely one of the more obfusc. My damn mouth! It's one of the harder parts to parse. My brain isn't working and my mouth isn't working right now, but I agree with you. There's something here, and I just can't. It's like I'm reaching into a bag with one thing in there, and I can't find that one thing, and it's maddening.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
misspoke there. She is actually described to us directly by the narrator in 2 sentences. Well, 3, I guess, if you count this as description. The Chi-Com Mac-10 was nowhere, at least by any casual eyes, to be seen. She was wearing a fawn jumpsuit of some loose cotton weave, accessorized in different shades of red, eyeglass frames, scarf, belt, and suede cowgirl boots that might have set her back somewhere in the mid-3 figures. Red designer barrettes held her hair sleekly back from an articulate brow and temples that often seemed ready to betray more than the shielded eyes ever would. And I'm not getting anything out of that. But as another instance of probably thematically resonant dress in the chapter, earlier we had this situation of Takeshi and DL starting their business, and Takeshi is wearing a black suit and DL is wearing a white silk gi. And in that case, you have, kind of some fairly straightforward, like, oh, well, the Asian guy has to dress in Western clothes, and DL, in order to exoticize herself, has to dress in the martial arts uniform. But with this, she is not wearing, like, the business clothes, and she's not wearing, like, the Western female dress code, in, like, a traditional sense. And neither is she wearing anything remotely traditional to Vietnam. And that's where I run out of steam.
See, and I'm skimming over some of these pages right now, and I'm thinking back to what I said earlier, and then I read and I remember that they also, despite the fact that they give her this job and they basically go by whatever she says, they also don't really speak kindly of her all the time.
No, they
So
really don't.
It's
They treat her like they do a boss, even though they are technically in charge.
Yeah. I don't know. I would love, if anybody listening has like anything that they want to add to this, I would genuinely love to know what everyone else makes of it, because I know there's something here. I know there's more than just one something here. So I would love to get some interpretations from listeners.
I mean, it's entirely to potentially be just grasping at straws. It is entirely possible that she is just a metaphor for the Vietnam War as a conflict.
That's entirely possible.
You have like this sort of mixture of, in her outfit, I get the sense of like a mixture of obviously American clothing, that being like the cowboy boots and everything, but also this sort of mixture of like French clothing or European designer clothing. And France was involved in Vietnam before America was, if I remember correctly. But more deliberately, from an allegorical perspective, you have a Vietnamese woman who, in theory, is in a position of less power against these American guys who should have more power to exert in that situation, because they're like her legal guardian somehow. They are her employer, technically, like we've mentioned a couple times, they are her boss, but despite all of that power and authority that they should have, they are frightened of her. They are in a losing position compared to the decisions that she makes. And that is sort of very much a mirror to at least America's involvement in Vietnam, from a standpoint of, the number one military in the world going into this tiny country that most people hadn't heard of at the time in America, and while never losing a firefight on the actual battlefield, still lost the war and still were completely outdone by, a significantly less powerful, less well-equipped fighting force. Like that could just be what Pinchon is doing there. But I don't know. There's no easy answer to it.
Yeah, and even more so, there's the fact that she was educated at it's a French name, but it translates to the School of Young Women, and it's a French name. Like, if you're going to be looking at it at her as a stand-in for the entirety of the Vietnam War, or the Vietnam as an actor in that war, then there might be something to be said there about, like, well, Americans think it's all about us. Maybe she was just some girl that Gorman Flaff met on tour and somehow didn't do any wrong to her and thought, hey, you deserve to go to school, and paid for her to go to this French school. We're getting all of this stuff third hand, and there's a lot of mediation going on, and she's not some like icon of traditional Vietnamese living.
Mm-hmm.
Whether she never had a chance or it was just not the context that she grew up in.
I do kind of have some vague thoughts about how they make her an equal partner in the business, but then they're also scared of her and talk shit about her. To the fact that, like, the US in the Vietnam War would have been ostensibly equal partners with the South Vietnamese government. Um, and yet like the Viet Cong were still very strong in South Vietnam, and the citizenry of South Vietnam were not necessarily a big fan of Americans. I think you might see where I'm going with that, where, like, we're supposed to be equal partners with South Vietnam, but they were antagonistic towards us. Maybe not the government, but the citizenry. And I'm sure that Vietnamese or American soldiers probably did not have super positive or enlightened views on the South Vietnamese citizenry, as well, where, like I said, we were supposed to be equal partners with South Vietnam, and um, even if we outnumbered them and, um, kind of we're supposed to be the people kind of in charge, or at least it's supposed to be equal. That relationship, while it was supposed to be positive, was largely a negative. I think there's might be something there with that.
Yeah, I agree. She seems to be certainly a synthesis of a lot of things with that conflict, and the fact that she was introduced to them in 1975 is significant on its own, because that was the last year of South Vietnam existing. That was the last year of the refugees, like, trying to get out of South Vietnam when the North was running over the border. Like, it's there's a lot there, and I think it just requires someone to really be able to piece it together as far as what Pinchon might be driving towards. That's another thing to throw out to you guys, our listeners. Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you have any additional historical context to add in? What was your reaction to her presence in the book? How did you feel about it? Please do write in and let us know. Maybe we're all crazy. Who knows? So kind of moving on from that, Cody, you had a note in here about TV and society and kind of building on the themes that we've talked about already across the book. Do you want to kind of expound upon that?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's not much I can tremendously add from what we already kind of talked about. I think a main theme of this book is the impact that TV has had on society, on individuals, and the ubiquitousness that it became around this time. And I think it's most prevalent in this chapter with characters, specifically Blood, and at the end of the chapter, Prairie, kind of trying to view everything through the lens of a TV show, and how it's indicative of how impactful TV has been, especially I think more so for Blood, because I think Prairie is at the end of the chapter just kind of hoping that the situation could be like a TV show where it's just everything could be easily resolved and all the loose ends tied up nicely in a neat little bow. I think Blood is more. I think we're seeing him as more of the dangerous side of TV, where the ability to separate reality from a TV episode or a movie is much more blurred for him. He wants the DL and Takeshi story to be a sitcom. Him and Vato both, are reworking the Chipmunks theme song to or Chippendale Rescue Rangers, I think it was. So it's the pervasiveness of TV and what it has done. And we talked earlier too about the Thanatoids and their use of TV and how that can be viewed in a number of different ways. So I just think that this is it's especially interesting given how much of this story is structured in a sort of television trope manner. Like we talked earlier about the Godzilla foot and how the electroanalysis of it, was very convenient to, sorting out exactly what it was.
Yeah. Isaiah 2:4's entrance into the chapter.
Exactly. Yeah. There's so much of this book that is structured in a television episode kind of way, entirely purposeful, obviously. But it lends itself so well to being able to, reflect on the impact that TV has had on almost every facet of life at this point by 1984 in the story and in 1990 in the time that this book was published.
Yeah, I agree. It's taking all of my willpower not just to talk about David Foster Wallace for half an hour in response to that, because so much of what he wrote about maps very cleanly in ways that I think maybe are easier to digest than potentially the level that Pinchon is working on here. But I'll spare our listeners the info dump there.
We could do a bonus episode on that. That would be
good. I could definitely just go nuts. But no, I agree. I think that the fact that the book is structured in a very television episode kind of format is very telling of the things that the Pinchon has on his mind, and kind of the pervasiveness of TV from a very metafictional perspective, not just affecting the characters, but also affecting the writer of what you're reading. Mm-hmm. That idea that structuring TV like reality eventually will bleed into reality and into the things that, we write and consume that aren't in and of themselves television. I think that there's a lot there. Does anyone else have anything to add on to that?
Anybody remember long, long ago that hanging signifier of the fig? Well, I think that a lot of what's going on with what you're talking about there, Cody, with the kind of the it's almost like intra-metafictionalization. I don't know what to call it. Like it is non-metafiction, but it is trying to situate things as such. Is that the so much of this book can be viewed structurally as a loving response to the Odyssey, and I've been holding my tongue because honestly it's not I don't find it a very interesting thing to talk about. But in terms of the structural apparatus of television in this book, I think that it must be considered that the Odyssey is also like 90% people telling stories to Telemachus, or Odysseus telling stories to other people who are hosting him for dinner. Everything in that very old epic poem which is being told as, song and poetry told by traveling storytellers, is essentially traveling storytellers telling their stories to other people. And in that same way, this is kind of like an inversion of that, with the actual structure of the book forcing you to look at it through this televised lens, and half of the characters viewing it in that way, but there not being any real, like, in the way that the 50s and 60s early postmodernism in fiction was infatuated with metafiction. It's not the point. Mm-hmm. It's just here.
Mm-hmm. It's not the point. It's just here. Can I get that like crocheted on a pillow for Christmas, Will?
I cannot crochet, but I can tie a
Mm.
couple random knots.
Get a Sharpie and just scrawl it on there.
Yeah, that works.
That might even be better. So, moving on, we have the aforementioned Bigfoot segment. Who wants to kind of give their thoughts on that chunk of it?
This is still in the section of the chapter that I struggle to get anything out of, but there's some interesting discussion in that section about the way that these indigenous tribes viewed things. That kind of implies that the word used is woge or woje, or I think it's woge.
I think so.
Yeah.
I'm not 100% on the pronunciation, but
Yeah, and there seems to be kind of this addition by subtraction of the idea that long ago there were these small people, which is similar to the ideas that survive in the current day in Iceland and Greenland about fairies. The idea that these little people just disappeared, and because they disappeared, we are now the little people. That we kind of like it by being the one people left, we create the larger people, who are the Bigfoots / Sasquatches.
I think the interesting thing too is there's some stuff here that really recalls some of the thematic elements in Mason and Dixon, which obviously from a standpoint of publication order would come after this, but for us that was the book we just finished reading.
well, but he was also, I mean, he was writing it concurrently, so
Yeah, no, absolutely.
there's overlap
So
there.
I think like that was for me what I kind of took out of this section was the fact that it seems like those ideas are kind of still in germination, where talking about these older tribes of either indigenous people or pre Homo sapien people, or kind of the idea of like these gods receding from view and sort of watching us, waiting to see if we live correctly and then returning to punish us if we don't. I feel like a lot of that is very interesting territory that he mines a lot more in Mason and Dixon.
Yeah.
But its presence here in Vineland does obviously signal what he was thinking about at the time and like what he was finding particularly important. I think the sort of interesting idea in its presence in this book is the sort of synthesis of different religious ideas. I guess I'll just read the quote that I'm kind of talking through here, where it says, "They took the North Spooner exit and got on River Drive. Once past the lights of Vineland, the river took back its older form, became what the Yuroks it had always been said to be, a river of ghosts. Everything had a name. Fishing and snaring places, acorn grounds, rocks in the river, boulders on the blanks, groves, and single trees with their own names, springs, pools, meadows, all alive, each with its own spirit. Many of these were that what the Yurok people called woge, creatures like humans but smaller, who had been living here when the first humans came. Before the influx, the woge withdrew. Some went away physically forever, eastward over the mountains, or nestled all together in giant redwood boats, singing unison chants of dispossession and exile, fading as they were taken further out to sea, desolate even to the ears of the newcomers, lost. Other woge, who found it impossible to leave, withdrew instead into the features of the landscape, remaining conscious, remembering better times, capable of sorrow. And as seasons went on, other emotions as well, as the generations of Yurok sat on them, fished on them, rested in their shade as they learned to love and grow deeper into the nuances of wind and light, as well as the earthquakes and eclipses and the massive winter storms that roared in, one after another from the Gulf of Alaska. For the Yuroks, who had always held this river exceptional, to follow it up from the ocean was also to journey through the realm behind the immediate. Fog presences glided in coves, dripping ferns thickened audibly in the gulches, semi-visible birds called in nearly human speech, trails of that warning would begin to descend into the earth towards Sorek, the world of the dead. Vato and Blood, who, as city guys you would think might get creeped out by all this, instead took to it as if returning from some exile of their own. Hippies they talked to said it would be reincarnation, that this coast, this watershed, was sacred and magical, and that the Woge were really the porpoises who had left their world to the humans, whose hands had the same five-finger bone structure as their flippers. Okay. And gone beneath the ocean, right off around Patrick's Point in Humboldt, to wait and see how humans did with the world. And if we started fucking up too bad, added some local informants, they would come back, teach us how to live the right way, save us. Yeah, I think that like there's a lot of interesting stuff in there about like the sacredness of the land and the development of land as a holy thing.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously with, I mean, some of the themes of clear-cut logging that gets brought up all the time in the background of this book. It's never too like specifically in the action happening. It's just sort of when characters are going from one place to another. Pynchon always mentions that there's logging going on, or that you can ask these particular people who will go up in trees and exactly measure you how much board length you're going to get out of it. Like there is a specter of the logging industry haunting this book from beginning to end, and I think that some of that is meant to be thought about through these sections where Pynchon is talking about, again, like the sacredness of the land, the fact that there is something holy in the land, but also there is a real religious synthesis, as I kind of mentioned before, reading the quotes in these portions here, where you have indigenous spirituality, you have reincarnation, which is most commonly associated with Buddhism, but is also a part of indigenous spirituality in certain tribes. You have the kind of hippie alternative spirituality being brought into it through Vato and Blood's sort of, I guess, interpretation or understanding of this particular place of land. So it's also drawing in these ideas of the kind of interesting spiritual expansion or synthesis or syncretism that was going on in the 80s, as we've talked about in prior episodes. But it all is being done with a very clear reverence for the land, where no matter what your position is, whether you're a hippie, whether you're one of these indigenous people, whoever you may be or whatever your opinions are, it still comes back to this idea that the land should be respected, treated well, and that if, that isn't the case, then we're going to be shown how it should be treated. And again, all of this is in Mason and Dixon to much greater detail, but I think some of it also gets to the idea that when we really ramped up our despoiling of the environment would again be the 80s, with the expansion of industry, with the expansion of logging, with the expansion of just sort of capitalistic business as a whole. And there is certainly something very timely about that being present in this book. Something to keep in mind, I think, as we continue to read through and get to the end, with it sort of being established here at the middle of the novel.
Well, to piggyback off of the kind of last point that you were making there about the sort of capitalistic expansion and desecration of the environment, I think that's also, and we talked about this in the Mason and Dixon episodes as well, is that's arguably the most common thematic element throughout all of his books. Mm-hmm. It's definitely, and again, going back to, I think it was at the beginning of this book where we talked about the settings for all of these books tend to occur at times of major shifts in the cultural zeitgeist, in the way that the environment was being affected by our actions, and by the sort of growth of capitalism as this almost cancerous sort of entity that would just be the sort of impulse behind all of these shifts. With going back as far as Mason and Dixon, where they're coming over to America and we start reshaping the land so that we can essentially find ways to thrive and create business and economic opportunities through against the day where the expansion of the railroad across the country that we've at that point decimated and clear cut to make way for this new business to come through. And it always comes back to these ways of our obsession with economic growth and industry has blinded us to the point where we no longer really care about what we're doing. And that, I think it's these kind of spiritual passages and these references, these callbacks to the more ancient religions and the way they revered the land and the way that they respected the land, with the consequence of not doing so being that the land will eventually retaliate and will show us the error of our ways, which I think is always kind of what's being hinted at, especially when you look at the Lovecraftian elements that are almost always tied to a large, almost terrestrial sort of Lovecraftian horror. I think that's the kind of bleed through of this is the environment starting to wake up and bring forth its revenge, which could also, you could probably tie that into the Godzilla thing of going back to that conversation about the Godzilla films and where they came from. So I think that's kind of the through line with all of these works is what you were getting at with that last argument.
So my response is going to be an excursion to the crazy theory corner.
All right. We need music.
But
we need music
in a different way, though.
Okay.
Okay. So I don't know if this is something that this intentionality doesn't matter very much in our conversations here. This is one that I think it's worthwhile to consider. In that particular section about the hippies theorizing, something to keep in mind alongside the general syncretism of the 80s, like you pointed out, is that the ideas that come out of these hippies thinking about all of these Yurok folklore ideas don't really have a whole lot to do with the actual substance that we see as framed as actual historical traditional ideas, right? What you have is these people who Pynchon throughout his works has been very critical about the way they interpret things. Taking this idea and taking it all the way to the extent of like, yep, and the porpoises are the woge. And to tie into the larger conversation about the land, the way that Pynchon talks about it in general is not something that I would consider this way, but the specific way it's talked about in this section verges on Volkish, to use some jargon. And for those who don't know what that means, some kind of quasi-fascist theorizing. This very syncretic faux traditionalism of reaching for what you believe the local inhabitants of the land thought. Because the Nazis, had, they called themselves Christians, but they also called themselves a lot of things. And a big strain of their intellectual side was on this obsession with folklore. And this seems like, maybe incidentally, kind of a commentary on the way that the hippie movement had begun to converge directly with the people who had made up the hippie movement, began to converge immediately with the fascists that they had spent their youths railing against. And at the very least, it reminds me a lot. It reminds me, it's not in here really, outside of just some vague allusion with the porpoise idea, of the kinds of thinkers who were publishing in the 80s and 90s, and who Pynchon had almost certainly had thousands of conversations with before they were published, because those ideas tend to boil for a while, talking about things like, well, we're aliens coming and speaking to these indigenous people. And I think that there are too many little links that hook together there. And again, it doesn't read to me like something that would have been an intended aspect of the section, but it all kind of bundles together at the same time in my eye.
Yeah, I can definitely see what you're getting at.
Mm-hmm.
All that being said, bundling together, so to speak, to use Will's terminology, is there anything else that anyone wants to add before we move on to funny parts?
I just want to express my appreciation for the kick out the jams joke that was in there. That shit was funny as hell.
Also, everyone should go listen to the MC5.
Oh yeah, MC5
They're
are awesome.
a very forgotten band. I'm staring at my box set of all their records as I'm saying this.
That's one of those bands that I think the original quote was about the Pixies, but somebody said that the Pixies were they weren't the band that got the most respect, but they were the band that everyone who listened to them wanted to go start a band. I feel like the MC5. You could say the same thing about
Velvet
the
Underground.
Was it Velvet Underground? Okay,
Yeah.
that's what I'm thinking of. Yeah. You could say the same thing about the MC5. I don't think we would have a lot of the music that came after them without them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the boldness to have your first album be a live record is something that I don't think has ever been repeated. But it is an incredible live album, one of the best ever. So
I have one more thing.
Yeah, Will.
Yeah, I think that Weed Atman at least deserves a mention. I think that it's notable that he's the only Thanatoid that we actually kind of get like an origin story for.
Oh, fair, yeah.
Because with the rest of them, we're kind of, like we talked about earlier, or like I talked about, and we all talked around earlier, the idea that Thanatoids are like, they're not necessarily like actually dead, and they might actually be dead at the same time. Like they are in this very transitional phase, and Weed is the one who we get to see the transformation into that middle ground.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point to make. I think that obviously that's not the last that we see of him in the book, if I remember correctly. So
no, absolutely.
Yeah, we should have more to talk about as he crops back up.
Yeah.
But definitely a good call out. Were there any funny parts that anyone wanted to mention that didn't come up naturally over the course of the conversation?
Yeah, I would say Blood and Vato's 2001 Space Odyssey high five ranks up there for me. I don't just I have tried to imagine how that would play out. As well written as it is, I just it's too weird.
It is quite interesting. But then again, we are talking about two people who listen to the Psycho soundtrack while they're driving at night.
They're tooling around.
which would be my funny part to mention. I find that so hilarious that they specifically put on the track that Vivian Lee listens to when she drives around at night while they're driving around at night.
There's so much good music jokes and references throughout this chapter.
Yeah, in this chapter specifically for some reason.
Yeah.
I really, beyond the slapstick of the normal, like, watching Takeshi just take these endless series of pills and, like, being everyone around him thinking, you're clearly trying to kill yourself, dude. And he's just like, what are you talking about?
Nah.
That's just great slapstick. But also, just the specific, like, drug mixes he's on are deeply funny.
Yeah.
Like, they are very silly.
Like, he looks at the label of that medication bottle, and it specifically remarks that everything he's currently on is listed as something not to mix it with. And then he just decides to go for it anyway.
Well, and this I mentioned it in the last episode. The simple idea of packaging together what they call methadone is methamphetamine, everybody. Methamphetamine and amobarbital. Like, what? Why is that an idea anyone thought made any sense? Amobarbital lasts like 2 hours. Meth lasts like 12.
Why not?
Both bad for you.
I do also shout out as a funny part to the description of the horrible nightmare he has when he does eventually sleep, like when he lands in the U.S. And just the fact that he's been up for I think like 3 days at that point, and then finally his body just gives out, and it's just the worst night's sleep that anyone has ever had, as opposed to the opposite. I guess that brings us into quotes. Does anyone volunteer to go first?
I'll go first. I went last time, so I prevent everyone from stealing from me. So I was gonna. This is another situation where I don't know what I want to do here, because I was gonna go with those 2 paragraphs that you read earlier, Kate, about the woge and all that. Beautiful prose. I absolutely love that part. But after talking about it today, I think I'm gonna go with, on page 168, Takeshi zipped into an open space and killed the motor. By the time they got inside Your Momma Eats and had a closer look, it was too late to do anything but make mental notes on where the exits were. They sat in a booth of scuffed turquoise plastic and tried to avoid eye contact with everybody, including each other. It turned out that YME was a famous barbecue joint in this area. The windows were painted black, and the counter ran all the way around a huge central pit where different hardwoods glowed, and the cooks tended, basted, pulled, or sliced cuts of beef and pork, hot links and ribs, wood smoke being drawn out at the vents lazily enough that some mixed with the cigarette, and joint smoke already in the air. Takeshi ordered the galaxy of ribs, and DL thought she'd have the brisket fantasy, but mainly what they were interested in was coffee. I think what made me want to switch over to that from what I had originally chosen was just the fact that it's good. It sounds like it makes me hungry. I don't know what a galaxy of ribs would constitute, but I'm down for it.
Just literally like 60 ribs just piled on a plate.
Stacks of ribs.
Luke, what was your quote?
Mine's from 191, the last page of the chapter. They arrived at the mouth of an oversized freight elevator, scrambled inside, and began to plunge ear-poppingly hellward. Aged fluorescent bulbs buzzing and flickering until the brakes caught just when it seemed too late, and they boomed to a stop and came out into a tunnel deep underground, which led them under the creek bed and then slowly uphill for half a mile, where they exited at last into brightly sunlit terrain, where they could hear in the distance the invading motor convoy and the blades of the helicopters, merged in an industrious roar that could as well have been another patch of developer condos going up. So that may not be like the best prose in this section. I just find it very easy to picture and like very cinematic, and I just really love that paragraph.
That's a good one.
Especially
Also,
like
the word ear-poppingly is really good.
Yeah, and the fact that kind of there's an inherent like fear element to the closing of this chapter and sort of the unknown, and Pynchon underscores that after all that nature writing with a new set of condos are being developed. Like, it's great thematic work that he's doing. Well, big ass pick.
Well, I will say that was one I was considering, Luke. So I'm glad someone chose it. But I'm going with, and again, apologies to anyone trying to read along. I do not have the page numbers in front of me. But way back at the beginning of this half, you have Takeshi just about to get hopefully healed. He went on an intensive program of Puncutron sessions, herbal therapy, brainwave recalibrations. Some of these turned out to involve DL. They realized they were being somehow tuned to each other. Could be brainwaves, could be chi, maybe good old ESP. They would lie hooked up side by side like actors in a brain transplant movie, while the Puncutron vibrated in Takeshi, his musical preferences mysteriously self-revised. Now listened through earphones to soul-strumming Tibetan chants. He still had no idea who she was. And I really like the prose of that one, but also it's kind of fun because in the middle of this otherwise very kind of normally literary novel, relative to Pynchon's other works, is this full cyberpunk scene. Like, it's in the mode of like a noir. It's all of this sci-fi junk happening, and yet fundamentally it's just about two people who don't know each other.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very good instance of his genre sampling. It's great.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I mean, the whole concept of the ninjet people are pretty cyberpunk. Just
For sure.
yeah, just so much referential material there for sure. My quote comes from page 187 and more or less picks up after the two paragraphs that I had read a little bit ago. The orchard Vato and Blood were looking for was on the other side of Shade Creek, meaning the usual difficult passage over the ruins of the old WPA bridge where, somehow, mysteriously, at least one lane was always open. Sometimes entire segments vanished overnight, as if floated away downriver on pontoons. Detours were always necessary, often with the directions crudely spray-painted onto pieces of wall or old plywood shuttering, in the same bristling typeface as gang graffiti. There were always crews at work, around the clock. Tonight, Vato and Blood had to wait while a truck piled high with smashed concrete and corroded iron rod went grinding back and forth by its own routes of beaten earth. Figures in fatigues, and sometimes helmets could be seen. Always in small groups, maybe corps of engineers, nobody was sure. They did not interact with the public, not even as flagmen. Drivers were left to decide how safe it was to proceed. Blood inched the rig forward, past great triangular rents in the pavements, through which, screened by a rough weave of reinforcing rods, they could see the river of midnight blue below. The work had been going on since the '64 storm, when the 7th, cresting, had taken part of the bridge. Broken silhouettes had stood against the sky for all the years since. It's... like, there's just so much in that paragraph. Again,
Yeah.
like there's... This is... I've said this, like, 4 times this episode, but, like, I could probably talk for a half an hour about the quote that I just read out, because there's so much in that paragraph. There are allusions to the despoiling of the environment. There are allusions to the futility in like modernization and the building of modern structures and modernity, because it's literally failing, and they've been spending 20 years trying to, constantly repair what it is that they put up. There are allusions there to sort of the stuff in Inherent Vice about strange figures showing up in public that are there to like cause everything in this dream to come crashing down. Like, there's just so much good material in just that one paragraph. That again, like, Vineland deserves a closer reading from everybody. Like, that's the whole point of the reason we're doing this book. Like, please. This is the only time we've ever been kind of stumped by something in a Pynchon novel.
It brought us to a damn standstill for
yeah. Like, there's so much good stuff in here, and it's a book that, like, especially as I'm going through it again for a second time, with kind of all of the years of life that I've lived between the first time I'm reading it and now. Like, there's so much more that I'm picking up on this second reading that I just completely missed the first time through, and I'm gonna be tempted to just read the book again when we finish it, to be completely honest.
Yeah, I know. I'm on the same boat.
Yeah, and I've brought it up a few times, and the reason I've brought it up a few times this far is that this is the only part of post hiatus Pynchon's work. I have not read Bleeding Edge. I might be missing out on that. This is the only chapter that I can think of out of this, Mason and Dixon, Against the Day, Inherent Vice, that has the same depth of like social criticism and structural like flippancy is the word I'm going to use.
Mm-hmm.
That he really that is what gave Gravity's Rainbow the reputation it has today. This is like the only book that contains this kind of intensity, and it's buried right in the middle, and I guess it's buried too deep.
Yeah, that's for sure. What was everyone's most Pynchon part of the chapter?
Mine is probably the relationship between Blood and Vato, and just how they kind of go back and forth and argue about, the words that they're singing and stuff. It's a very like Pynchon-esque relationship that they have, where they're kind of like frenemies in some ways.
Mm-hmm. Very true. Will, what about you?
So I'm gonna bring up a part that we mostly ignored because there's not that much to dig into except for humor here. But it's so Pinchonian, and it is so much that same, like, sorry about that. It is so much that same kind of mode of obscene, like, earnestness, I guess.
Mhm.
It was tonight or never as far as Prairie was concerned. All the variety loaves, stacked in a distant niche of the freezer, had begun to glow, softly blue-green, like a nightlight for the rest of the frozen food, not, as once supposed, safely dead, but no, only, queerly, sleeping, or perhaps only pretending to sleep. Ah! Like everybody else in the kitchen, Prairie had a threshold for how long she could spend in that sinister freezer before some more than thermometric chill sent her back out into the less clearly haunted world, pulses thumping. Because yes, obviously it's, we're getting kind of a description of Prairie, but this is actually this is not her perspective. It is just the narrator is so freaked out that he's right on board with her.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Man, how could we forget the loaf? Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, that's an oversight on our part.
The fact that the FDA came to confiscate
EPA.
or the EPA, came to confiscate most of it is insane.
And Prairie's seriously considering serving it to people.
She is, like, apparently she's become the chef of this chateau and is now deciding whether or not she wants to poison everyone beyond repair.
And just so if some ungodly reason someone is listening to this without having read the book, I was not adding anything to that. That is how it's written.
Yep.
Nope, that's just literally how it's there. I'm gonna have to go to the audiobook and listen to see how he reads out that line.
Oh, that would really be interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say my most pinch on part of the chapter, I'm tempted to pick just the existence of that loaf, but I'm going to go with what my original one was, which is just the repeated joke motif of all of the different, like, workshops and, like, strange, like, community classes that are available. Like, we didn't really talk about it during the earlier section of this chapter when it lists off the different stuff, like the like criminal prosecutors convention or whatever it's called, that Brock Vond is at in Japan. But just all of those classes that Pinchon is coming up with and all those seminars, that's another thing that feels very distinctly 80s, when, like, the intensive or the workshop or the 3-week boot camp or whatever became, I think, a really big thing for a while. So the fact that he's finding every possible reason to put one of those classes in there feels very accurate to the time.
And Vato and Blood had their towing conference.
Yeah. Just leaves you, Cody.
So I would say I think I would have to go with the Puncutron and just the general concept of that and everything, all of the accoutrement that goes with it. It's one of those things that I feel like, and like we mentioned earlier, like, we're looking at the audio tapes that were available to listen to while you were being worked, or whatever you would call an experience in there. I feel like there's probably so much more that exists that was written for that just was trimmed down to, keep it concise and everything. But I just get the feeling that Pinchon put a lot of work into making that whole concept become a reality in the story. And I just love every aspect of that.
Yeah, it's a great element. Well, the audience's homework musically is to listen to the MC5. I think we
need to start having like a homework section for people that ties into,
definitely,
like, go watch this movie or go read this other book or check out this band or whatever. Yeah, MC5 would have to be the recommendation for the week.
Another 80s band, I'd say, MC5 weren't really 80s, but if we're talking about an 80s band, I'd say, like, Orchestral Movements in the Dark. That would be my next choice for everyone to listen to for for like a synth pop or I'll say aggressively 80s band as far as how they sound. Architecture and Morality in particular is a great album of theirs, but yeah, that'd be everyone's homework for this week, I'd say. Yeah, that's, I think, going to wrap it up for this episode of Mapping the Zone, and as well as our discussion on Chapter 9. Hopefully everyone has a good holiday. The links to our social media profiles are going to be in the show notes as always. Please feel free to write in on anything from Chapter 9 that you want to add some color to, or tell us that we got wrong, or any questions that you may have from your reading. There's a lot to dive into in this chapter, especially in the latter half of it. And we're going to be taking a bit of a break, right, Cody?
Yes. So we will, just so that we can all have our time off with family and holidays and everything like that. So our next episode will be on the 12th, January 12th, ideally, unless something happens, in which case we'll put notifications out wherever. But for right now, we'll be back January 12th.
Yeah, and when we return, we'll be discussing chapters 10 and 11. And
it's
until
only 25 pages, too.
Crazy. It's the same thing as in Mason and Dixon. As soon as he gives you some crazy stuff to really digest, he gives you a little bit of a reprieve.
Yeah, just enough.
Yeah, just enough. As always, everybody, thank you for listening. We'll see you at the next episode.
Bye.
See ya.
Bye.
World of cereal anymore.
I happen to think that our listeners would be very interested to hear what kind of cereal we all indulge in. I don't know what you're talking about, Cody.
Probably true. You never know.
Indulge in.
Yeah. Do you not find cereal to be an indulgence, William?
Are you taking the Andrew Tate train here and saying that food can't be pleasurable?
As somebody whose anxiety has interfered mostly with that whole experience, I can say yes, but yeah, no. I just think that cereal is a necessity, you know.
Oh, I see. Okay, so it's rather like bread, water, blood.
It's a right more than a privilege.
Yeah, rather than something that you go out of your way to earn.
Yeah, exactly. Cereal, aspic, beer. Yeah, beer.
Okay.
That one works.
I mean, I eat cereal on a daily basis. So
Hell yeah, I do too.
It's been a while since I ate it on a daily basis, but I do have it when I don't want to cook myself something for breakfast before I go to work.
Yeah, I don't have time to like make a proper decent breakfast before I work because I have to take my kids to school and then come back and start work. So cereal's like my go-to. Weekends are different. I actually have time to make like breakfast food. But even then, I'll have a bowl of cereal for dinner or just during the day. I love it. It's great.
Some of those Special K cereals are pretty good if you're just looking for like a snack, because they have like chocolate and stuff in them.
That's true. And some of them like they've got like the yogurt stuff in there too, the dehydrated yogurt or whatever.
Yeah.
Did y'all ever eat grape nuts?
Unfortunately,
Yeah.
My mom used to love them. Like I would eat them a lot as a kid. I don't know why. And I still like find myself every now and then I have this bizarre, I think maybe it's my Catholic upbringing and my drive for self-torture or something that I just occasionally want to go back and have a bowl of grape nuts. And then I'm like, no, I don't want to eat rocks. So I'm going to pass on that.
As soon as you get 2 bites into there.
Not even like I can pass the box up on the shelf at this point in my life. I'm like, nope. Fool me once.
Oh, this is a bit random, but I did finish the ice shirt the other day.
Oh yeah, what'd you think?
I liked it a lot. I probably like the parts set in like the modern day a little bit more than the ones in the past. I mean, they're shorter. I found my attention wandering a little bit less.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'm curious to. I got Fathers and Crows. I don't know what I'm going to start it because as dense as Ice Shirt was, Fathers and Crows is like 3 times longer, so that's a real commitment.
I don't think I've ever come across a Bowman book in the wild.
I haven't either. Like I check every time I go to Half Price Books. I check. There's never anything there. Our indie bookstores here never have his stuff. Our Barnes and Noble here never has it. I had to go to. I don't even remember where I got Fathers and Crows online.
The only one that I've ever encountered is Europe Central. I've seen Europe Central a fair number of times at Barnes and Noble, but that's pretty much it.
For some reason, I've seen Europe Central and Rainbow Stories. Those are the ones.
At used stores or like new?
No, these are new.
Huh.
I just presume that the university here has someone who teaches. Otherwise, I can't think of why Rainbow Stories would get that attention.
That could be.
Oh man, I'm excited for the start of the next semester, not because it'll mean that I'm super busy at work again, but because I work across the street from the college bookstore and I can go see what critical resources they have for sale for the English classes on campus. What was the most rare or most interesting vinyl that you guys bought during your time there?
So we didn't have a lot of records until around the time I was leaving. It was a lot more of it was CDs. I would say the rarest CD we bought, and I ended up buying it for myself because it was one that we didn't have in our system. Our inventory system ran through Amazon. So if Amazon didn't have a listing for it, we had to manually put it in, which for me meant a lot of times jumping on Discogs and trying to suss out what's a fair price for this kind of thing. Someone brought in, I don't know if you ever heard of Ambugalard, Geordie White's old band from before Marilyn Manson.
No.
Yeah, they brought in one of those on CD, and it was like this old, I think it was from 89 or 90, maybe even 91, way before he was in Manson. And I recognized it because I knew enough of Manson and Nine Inch Nails and all those backstories and bands they were in before then. So I knew the band, and I was like, that's one I'll probably never see. And I couldn't find it anywhere to properly batch it into the system. So I paid the dude I think it was 50 cents for that one and whatever else he brought in. When I ended up selling off my records and CDs and everything several years ago, that particular CD, I think I got $200 for it.
Dang.
Yeah. We got a couple of stuff. There was people would bring in stuff sometimes that we, for a number of reasons, couldn't buy, whether it was too damaged or if it was something that we had too many in stock of, or if it was just something that we couldn't care. Before we could actually buy records, people would bring in records and we couldn't take them. So sometimes it would just be I don't care, you guys can have them. So that's how I built up a lot of my record collection, was just people bringing in records that they didn't want to have to take them somewhere else, so they just dumped them off with us. So I picked up a couple of Metallica records that way, and I think I got a couple of Sonic Youth albums from there. We had a guy one time that brought in, I felt so bad for the dude because he brought in, it was 8 or 9 pretty hefty sized boxes, and his something happened. I don't remember. Someone in his family died, and he couldn't cover the funeral costs, and so he was basically selling off his entire collection to pay for that. And I felt real bad because it was a lot of good stuff, and so I made sure to I told everyone that was there, I was like, don't screw this dude. Give him as much as we can give him for everything he's got. I feel for the dude. But yeah, he brought in a ton of really cool stuff. I ended up buying a lot of it, but
there's a record store on the same block as me, which is a dangerous proposition.
Bet.
And they have an unopened first pressing of Washing Machine on the wall.
A vinyl or a CD?
Vinyl. Which is
that
crazy
was one
to
I
me.
could never find. That's my favorite Sonic Youth album too.
Yeah, the fact that it's unopened is wild.
That's so. How much are they asking for it?
$140.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, and they also have the 4-disc deluxe edition of Goo as well.
Yeah, I had both Goo and Dirty. I had the deluxe editions of, and Daydream Nation. I had those on vinyl. I had a lot of Sonic Youth. That was like my main. Sonic Youth and Nine Inch Nails were probably the two artists that I had the most of in my collection. I almost had every Halo for Nine Inch Nails. There was like two I was missing, I think.
Oh, nice.
I sold almost all of it to one dude in Colorado.
That's a lucky break.
Yeah, I listed it up all on Discogs, and I got an email from him like the day after I had it all listed. He's like, "Hey, I want all of this. Can you like help me out with shipping?" I was like, "Hell yeah, dude!" So
Nice.
yeah, I ended up sending him. I think it was like $400 or $500 worth of records.
Very cool. Yeah, I don't have much Sonic Youth or Nine Inch Nails. I've got Goo, I've got Sister, I've got Rather
Sister's a good one.
Ripped. Nine Inch Nails, I have the first two records, and I've got not the actual events EP. The bands that I have the most of, King Gizzard is by far the largest.
Sure.
That I have of any one artist. I think I have like close to 60 discs of King Gizzard. I don't have any repeats. It's just all their live stuff is huge.
There's
I have
so
like
many
all of the
bootlegs,
box
right?
sets. I have every bootleg that they've released. And I think the OCs is the band that I have the second most of. And then it's probably either Zappa or
I had a lot of Zappa too.
Or the Black Keys are the two like next most.
I had the Mailman almost ruined a really rare Nine Inch Nails record that I ordered a long time ago when I was at the time I was living at my mother-in-law's house, and I scored a copy on eBay of the Fragile, of first edition vinyl of Fragile, for like $50 before they ever reissued it, so it was like super duper hard to find. The mailman decided to leave it tied. I don't know why he took the effort to tie it to the mailbox, which was a pipe that my mother-in-law has is that functions as a mailbox, in the middle of Texas summer. And it like I just happened to come back home like maybe 30 minutes after he'd put it out there and managed to grab it in time. But I was like, Jesus, if that had sat out there for any longer, it would have been totally ruined.
Yeah, who knows? That's crazy. Yeah, the reissues of the Fragile are also pretty expensive too.
Yeah, they didn't do many of them. That was one that was probably the hardest album for me to part with when I sold all my stuff.
Understandable.
I almost kept it to frame it, but then I realized that I'd have to find a weird frame to fit a 3 LP vinyl. So
yeah, those are a bit thicker.
Oh, did you pick up that copy of Infinite Jest, Cody, or no?
No, I was telling Kate I had to go. We were killing time before my son's taekwondo belt test, and so I was like, I'll go back and pick it up. I was gonna pick it up and mail it over to her, but then they closed before we could get back over there. So, and then my wife was going to be in that part of town today, but she ended up not being in that part of town. So, I may be over there tomorrow. I'll see if they still have it.
I had a first edition that I inherited, but I sold it a year or two ago.
Was it first edition, first printing with the Volman misspelling?
I don't remember necessarily. I want to say it was. It did have a remainder mark on it, and it wasn't in like it was in like good condition, but not like it wasn't like super good condition.
Nice. Yeah, I was
One
telling
point-
Cody, I have
One
a
point
first edition third printing, but I haven't found a first edition first printing yet.
At one point, I owned like 3 copies of Infinite Jest because like I inherited like 2 of them and I already had one. Just ridiculous to have that many.
I have more than that.
I have, I think, 4 copies of Gravity's Rainbow.
Yeah, I have 4 copies right now. I'm trying to sell some of them because I'm trying to make myself kind of cut back.
Which editions do you have? I might be interested in buying 1 or 2.
I have the Picador edition. I have the 1987 Viking one. I have the mass market. And then I have that first edition, first printing I picked up off eBay a while ago.
Which Picador one do you have? Is it the one with the rocket in the legs on the
No,
bottom half?
it's the one with like the
Or is
like
that cool
kind of
like skull?
It's that cool skull one,
Oh,
yeah.
I love. Never have found one of those. I used to have the missile with the legs one, and I don't know whatever happened to it. It just disappeared.
Yeah, that one looks really cool. But yeah, the Viking one, like the cover is like taped on. I bought it for like $5 at Half Price Books. The one from 1987, which is like a facsimile of the 1973.
Mm-hmm.
And then the mass market's not in good condition at all.
Is the mass market one the gold one?
Yeah.
Gold cover. I have one of those too.
Yeah, I just have the one with the Frank Miller cover art.
That was the first one I got.
The corrected edition, I should say, after they fixed the pagination issue.
I had that one, but like the cover was basically fell off, and then I sold it back when I had an Etsy store.
I'd really love to find the Penguin Modern Classics one with the blueprint on the front.
That one took me a while to find.
Yeah, I've never seen that one in the wild.
That one, there was a while where I found a few of them at Half Price Books. The one I have is from there, and I think it was like $8.
Oh, nice. I just ordered on Etsy the mass market paperback of V, the one with the giant stone V on the cover.
That's a great cover.
Yeah, I love that cover. And the seller is in Madison, so I emailed him and I was like, "Do you just do local pickup?" And he's like, "Nah, but I'll send it to you for free." And I got the shipping notification this morning. He's sending it through DHL.
What the hell?
And his address is like within walking distance of my house.
Oh my god!
It's like, dude, why?
He might. I mean, you might want to do that just so there's like a ship, like so you can't be like, "Oh, I never got the book" or
That's
whatever.
true. Yeah.
I guess.
I've done some of that in Dallas with like I've just dropped it off at people's houses. I did that when I lived in the Austin area too, but I was always worried that they would try to screw me.
Yeah,
I took the chance, but yeah.
I don't have the big stone V one, but I do have the one with the three faces on cubes and the woman standing behind it.
I don't know if I know what that one looks like.
Yeah, I found that one that you bought, Kate, the one with the stone V on the cover. I found that at Half Price Books for like $5 the other day.
Nice.
That's the one I have.
So what copies of Vineland are you all working with?
I have the Minerva edition. I have the Penguin one as well, but the Minerva one is the one I wanted to get for a long time because I like the cover on it.
Yeah, I have the one with like the trees on it, which I really like.
The hardback or the paperback?
The paperback.
Yeah, I think that's probably the same one I have too.
The really Penguin Modern Classics one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mine's a Penguin. Yeah, I don't know if it's Modern Classics or not, but
if it has a turquoise spine, it is Modern Classics.
Yeah.
Okay, mine's just green, I think. It might be, I guess it could be turquoise. I don't know.
Or like seafoam. Is it seafoam salad green?
Yeah.
Yeah, then that's the Modern Classics one.
Yeah, I think almost all of them have that.
Yeah, that's Penguin's like color for that series.
Does the copy of V that you're getting, does that include the uncorrected or corrected text in there?
I don't actually know. I'm not as familiar with the V printings as probably a lot of other people are.
As far as I know, the one I have, I know for sure the one I have is the quote unquote corrected one, because that's why I was seeking it out for a long time. But I in reading about it, it seems like it was the mass market paperbacks that were out of the U.S. are the corrected ones. So I'm curious if that's the same for that one you ordered.
Yeah, we'll have to figure out which one we're reading when we get to that.
Well, that's kind of the thing is I was going to, when we get to that, I wanted to include a conversation about those changes and how impactful they actually are.
Mm-hmm.
Just because I think that would be an interesting thing, because a lot of people can't find those copies of it, and the resources I found where it explains the differences in them It just kind of gives it, that specific line and what's different between the two versions. But I think, having the context of reading the rest of it before and after probably adds something to that. I haven't experimented with it yet, so.
Yeah. I mean, because the Harper Perennial Modern Classics one that you can find in most stores, that's the corrected text, right?
I don't think any of the US versions, aside from the mass market paperbacks, are the quote unquote corrected versions.
Okay.
It's a weird. It was a weird thing where they. Okay, so in 2012 it emerged there were multiple versions of V in circulation. This was due to the fact that Pynchon's final modifications were made after the first edition was printed, and thus were only implemented in the British or Jonathan Cape edition and the Bantam paperback. The fact was forgotten soon after in the US, so most US editions, including the newly released ebook, follow the first printing and are therefore unauthorized versions of the text, while the British editions, which follow the first edition printed by Jonathan Cape, contain Pynchon's final revisions.
So I have a sidebar question for the Texans here.
Uh-oh.
Or Texans by association, however you view yourselves.
I've been here my whole life, so.
Yeah. I'm giving Luke some wiggle room. Maybe he doesn't embrace it. But so the Rudies that have made it over here have almost this construction. Of course they have modern ventilation and therefore the fumes do not fill the buildings, but they are mostly built with the pit almost in the middle of all of the eating areas. Is that a thing that's all over there too?
First of all, I didn't know Rudy's extended all the way out there. I guess it kind of makes sense, but yeah, it's not uncommon from the ones I've gone to. I think it kind of depends on where you're going, because a lot of the more rustic barbecue places I've been tend to, if they're not set up with the pit in the middle, it's set up in such a way that it's almost a featured area. It's not set up like a normal kitchen would be, unless they've converted it from an older restaurant. A lot of times it's kind of made to be the focal point around which you want people to be able to see what's happening and to make sure that the smoke is getting around and being experienced by everyone. I've definitely been in some smoky ass barbecue places before.
Mm-hmm. Those are usually the best ones.
They really truly are, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's, I mean, and I will. Rudy's is not bad.
It's not great. It isn't bad though.
No, I would say
too much.
As a native Texan I've been here my whole life, I apply the same rule to barbecue places that I do to Mexican and Tex-Mex places. The more kind of hole in the wall places are your best bet. The more it feels like it's just someone's house that they've converted into a restaurant, that's going to be your go-to place.
Yeah, to go back to Will's original question, there are barbecue places here in Dallas that the barbecue pits are generally visible. I don't know about them being in the center of the restaurant, but they are almost always visible. A lot of places here will do, the more famous ones at least, will do tours of the barbecue pits and stuff like for tourists. There definitely does seem to be an emphasis on making the barbecue pits visible and accessible to the people eating there. That definitely does seem to be a thing. And yeah, they have Rudy's in Colorado even too.
That's wild.
Yeah.
Because that's the first one was opened here in San Antonio, and it's just kind of exploded since then.
What's weirder to me is that they turn them into you can buy gas at Rudy's.
Really?
What?
There's one, yeah, at least one here in Dallas that's also a gas station.
That's wild.
I think the one in Colorado too, you can buy gas at it.
Yeah, I've only been to the ones here, and then the first one in San Antonio. That's crazy.
I will also say a good way to know it's a good barbecue place is if you do not get a plate. If they serve you on a piece of wax paper, you're in the right place.
Mm-hmm. Or if there's like a slice of like white bread underneath all of the the food.
Okay, so I was thinking during our little break. I think what what this chapter specifically reminds me of, and this I may be just putting two things together that have no business going together. It's got me thinking of episode 8 of season 3 of Twin Peaks, and it's the
Okay.
the absolute density of it, and all of everything happening, and how pivotal all of it is to the story, and how almost impenetrable it is no matter how many times I go back to it. There's still so much of that episode that I just can't wrap my head around. But I know it's all vital to the story. There's the surface level reading, or the surface level watching of it and understanding the impact of the atomic bomb and all that kind of stuff. But I feel like there's so much more when you get into the giant and everything in the fireman's house and all. Like, there's just so much happening. That's what this had me thinking of, was that particular episode of that.
Yeah, that's not a bad reference.
Now I need to go back and just rewatch Twin Peaks again because I love that show.
This is the whole show?
I watch it like once a year at least. So.
The whole thing? You sit through episodes like 7 to 13 of season 2?
Yeah, they're not the best.
I can't, man.
It's hard. I tend to drift away, especially with the James subplot where he got
give me a
kidnapped.
fucking break.
Just it sucks because I know it wasn't Lynch's fault. I know the studio really shot itself in the foot, forcing Lynch and Frost to reveal a killer when that was never the intention.
Mm-hmm.
And then it really, like, it's a miracle they got back on track by the end and were able to bring in the whole Wyndham Earl subplot and everything and really bring it back to form.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, season 2 gets a lot of undue flack. I don't think as a whole it's as bad as people like to say it is, but those 6-7 episodes in the middle are not good really at all.
Oh yeah, I skip them.
Totally lost their way.
I sat through them once. I cannot do it again.
I usually, if I'm rewatching it, like I said, I'll just kind of zone out during those. Or if I'm watching it while I'm working, I tend to focus less on it. But I don't know. It's Twin Peaks is one of the shows that I'll just rewatch over and over. Not necessarily like sit down and like really devote all my attention to it. Rewatch. I do sometimes, but more often than not, it's just something to have on while I'm working that's familiar that I can just kind of still pick up little pieces of.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Like I just rewatched The Wire again for probably the 5th or 6th time.
That's not an inconsiderable amount of television to watch 6 times.
No, I love that show.
I've never seen
That's another one that the studio destroyed it in the end. But you've never seen it?
No.
Oh, it's absolutely incredible. It's I don't know. I can only say just go watch it because it's really, really, really good. It's supremely well done. It doesn't pull any punches with its storytelling and its depiction of both the police and the drug trade and how both sides were responsible for everything that happened to Baltimore and in a larger scale the country, really. But performances are amazing. The show's great.
Yeah, it definitely sounds interesting.
Also, I have a confession to make.
Uh-oh.
This has been a while since y'all have talked about this in the chat, but I do have to confess that I do enjoy the musical stylings of Red Hot Chili Peppers.
Oh yeah. But you're not you're not one of the fans that only listens to Red Hot Chili Peppers. So I think that's the distinction that needs to be made there.
Yeah, and I definitely they just have some deeper cuts that are good. I'm not like unequivocally a fan. It's just they have some songs, like probably like 10 to 15 songs I really like.
Yeah, I could name a few that I like. But it's just one of those bands that I just never gelled with. But my issue with them, I guess it's not really with them necessarily, but it's the fandom. The people that only like them are pretty insufferable.
Yeah.
And what band is this?
Red Hot Chili Peppers.
Oh yeah, fuck that.
I can think of worse fan bases, but
Mm-hmm.
they're up there. I would say Dave Matthews Band fans are probably worse.
Yeah, that's
Kid
for
Rock.
sure. Kid Rock is pretty. Yeah, that's rough.
Yep. That's a.
Kid Rock makes music for people who need to blow into a tube to start their car.